Quentin Vaughn sat in his office staring at the latest customer complaint report. His restaurant chain, which he had built from scratch over the last 15 years, had always prided itself on great food and even better service. But lately, something felt off. Customer complaints were piling up. The food was still good, but the service? That was another story. Slow responses, rude employees, and reports of people being turned away for no good reason. One complaint in particular had caught his attention. A traveler had been stranded during a snowstorm, looking for a warm place to eat and rest, only to be rudely dismissed by a waiter. Quentin leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had tried to get answers from his district managers, but they brushed it off. Probably an isolated incident, one of them had said. Nothing to worry about. But Quentin wasn't convinced. His restaurant chain had expanded to 15 locations, and while he had personally hired the first few employees years ago, most of the current staff had never met him. His face wasn't plastered all over the company website, and he didn't show up to every location often enough to be recognized. That gave him an idea. If he wanted to know what was really happening, he needed to see it for himself. A week later, Quentin arrived at one of his locations in a neighboring city. He had grown a thick beard, dyed his hair darker, and dressed in a worn-out flannel and jeans. He looked the part of a weary traveler, someone who had been on the road too long and needed a bite to eat. He stepped inside. The restaurant was half full, the hum of conversation mixing with clinking silverware. A few employees bustled around, but no one greeted him at the door. He waited. Nothing. Finally, he approached the host's stand, where a young woman with tired eyes was flipping through a seating chart. "Excuse me," Quentin said, keeping his voice even. "I was wondering if I could get a table." The hostess barely looked up. "We're full." Quentin glanced around. There were at least 5 empty tables. "Are you sure?" "I don't mind waiting." She sighed, clearly annoyed. "Look, we don't have space for walk-ins right now." Before Quentin could respond, a voice cut in. "Who's holding up the line?" A tall, broad-shouldered man in a neatly pressed uniform walked over. His name read Bryce, shift manager. "This guy wants a table," the hostess muttered. Bryce gave Quentin a once-over. His eyes lingered on the flannel, the worn-out boots. Then he scoffed. "We don't have room," Bryce said flatly. "Try somewhere else." Quentin clenched his jaw. "I've been driving for hours in bad weather. I'm just looking for a meal." Bryce crossed his arms. "Not my problem." Quentin exhaled slowly. "Isn't the restaurant open to the public?" Bryce chuckled. "Yeah, but we reserve the right to refuse service. We don't need drifters taking up space." That hit Quentin like a punch to the gut. A few diners glanced over, sensing the tension. Some employees looked uncomfortable, but no one said anything. Quentin felt his fingers tighten around his jacket. He could have walked away, could have gone to another restaurant. But this wasn't just about him. If this was how they treated one customer, how many others had been turned away? Quentin took a slow breath, steadying himself. "All right," he said, turning toward the door. "I'll go." As he walked out into the cold, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Quentin didn't go far. Instead, he slipped into his car, parked just across the street where he could observe the restaurant without being noticed. He needed to see more. One bad interaction could be an anomaly, but if Bryce's attitude was a reflection of how this location operated, there would be other signs. Through the large front windows, he watched the staff move around the dining area. Some worked diligently, rushing between tables, refilling drinks, and delivering plates with forced smiles. Others, particularly Bryce, seemed more interested in chatting with a select group of employees near the host stand. He leaned against the counter, laughing while the hostess occasionally glanced at the door, visibly uncomfortable. A few minutes later, a woman entered with 2 young kids, their winter coats dusted with snow. She spoke briefly to the hostess, who hesitated before looking toward Bryce. He barely acknowledged her before shaking his head and saying something Quentin couldn't hear. Whatever it was, the hostess straightened and shook her head at the woman. She looked confused, then frustrated. Quentin saw her lips move, probably asking why, before she turned and left, guiding her children back into the cold. Quentin's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Another rejection. And for what reason? There were still empty tables inside. He could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had come to gather information, not to act on impulse. If he stormed back and now, it wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he waited. An hour passed. He watched how different customers were treated. Some were greeted warmly and seated immediately. Others, mostly those who didn't fit a certain image, were met with hesitation or outright dismissal. A man in a worn jacket was told they were closing soon, despite the posted hours saying otherwise. A couple with backpacks was told there was a long wait, even though several tables remained open. It was a pattern, a deliberate one. Quentin had seen enough. He stepped out of his car, letting the cold air clear his head before walking back toward the restaurant. This time, he wasn't going in as a stranded traveler. He was going in as the man who built this company from the ground up. The moment he pushed open the door, Bryce glanced up, clearly recognizing him this time. His casual posture stiffened, but he quickly masked it with indifference. "Back again," Bryce said, his tone edged with annoyance. Quentin didn't respond immediately. He let the silence hang, let the weight of his stare settle over Bryce. It was only when the shift manager shifted uncomfortably that Quentin finally spoke. "Yes," he said evenly. "And this time I won't be leaving." The air in the room changed. A few employees looked over, sensing something different in his tone. The hostess, who had been quiet earlier, suddenly seemed more alert. Bryce crossed his arms. "Like I told you before, we don't have space." "You do," Quentin interrupted. "Plenty of it." Bryce opened his mouth to argue, but Quentin wasn't finished. "I've been watching this restaurant for the past hour. I saw you turn away multiple customers for no valid reason. Families, travelers, people just looking for a meal. And you sent them back into the cold while letting others walk right in." Bryce's expression hardened. "I don't have to explain myself to you." Quentin let out a slow breath. "Actually, you do." Something in his tone made Bryce falter. Quentin reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. He flipped it open, revealing the company ID he rarely had to use. The one with his full name and title clearly displayed. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Bryce's face. "My name is Quentin Vaughn," he said, his voice steady. "I own this restaurant, and every other location in this chain." A heavy silence fell over the room. The hostess's eyes widened. A few employees exchanged nervous glances. Even some of the customers who had been eating quietly now looked up, sensing the weight of the moment. Bryce swallowed, his usual arrogance faltering. I didn't realize." "No, you didn't," Quentin interrupted. "Because if you had, you wouldn't have treated me or any of those other customers the way you did." Bryce straightened, trying to regain control of the situation. "Look, we have policies." "No," Quentin cut in. "What you have is a broken sense of authority. This restaurant was built on welcoming people, on good service, not on treating customers like an inconvenience because they don't fit whatever standard you've decided on." Bryce's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Quentin turned to the hostess. Her face was pale, her hands gripping the seating chart tightly. "Has this been happening often?" he asked, his voice softer now. She hesitated, glancing at Bryce, then back at Quentin. "Yes," she admitted quietly. Quentin looked around the restaurant. Some employees were watching with anticipation, others with discomfort. "This stops today," Quentin said firmly. "Effective immediately." Bryce scoffed, trying to mask his nerves. "You can't just—" "I can," Quentin said. "And I am." He turned to one of the servers who had been working non-stop since he first arrived. "Who's the assistant manager on shift?" A woman near the back tentatively raised her hand. "You're in charge now," Quentin said. "Bryce, you're done here." Bryce spluttered. "You can't be serious." Quentin met his gaze without hesitation. "I am. Get your things and go." For a moment, Bryce looked as if he wanted to argue. But something in Quentin's expression made it clear there was no room for negotiation. Bryce exhaled sharply, then turned on his heel and stormed toward the back. The tension in the room slowly eased. Employees exchanged glances, some looking relieved, others still in shock. Quentin turned back to the hostess. "From now on, if someone walks through that door and we have space, they get seated. No exceptions." She nodded quickly. Quentin took another breath, feeling the weight of the situation settle over him. There was still more to fix, more to address. But for now he had taken the first step. And he wasn't stopping here. Quentin remained near the host's stand for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle. The restaurant had gone quiet after Bryce's departure. Employees exchanging uncertain glances, customers murmuring among themselves. He could feel the tension still clinging to the air. He turned to the assistant manager, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a cautious demeanor. She had been working hard all night, balancing between running food and managing the floor without much support. "Step into the back with me," Quentin said. "We need to talk." She hesitated but nodded, leading him toward the back office. The space was cramped, a desk cluttered with paperwork, a small security monitor mounted on the wall displaying different angles of the dining area. Quentin shut the door behind them. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his voice measured. The assistant manager exhaled, rubbing her hands together. "A while," she admitted. Bryce liked to run things his way. If he thought someone didn't fit the image of the restaurant, he found excuses to turn them away. Some of us pushed back, but he had friends in higher positions. Complaints never went anywhere. Quentin studied her. "And what about the rest of the staff?" She hesitated. Some of them followed his lead because they were scared of him. Others just didn't want to get involved. A few of us tried to make up for it when he wasn't around. But, she gestured vaguely, it was hard to fight against when he had control. Quentin nodded slowly. He had suspected as much. Bryce hadn't built his arrogance in a vacuum. He had been enabled, either through neglect or fear. "Who else in management shares his mindset?" Quentin asked. She hesitated again, then shook her head. "No one else is as blatant as he was. But there's a culture here, one that lets people like him thrive." That was what Quentin needed to hear. This wasn't just about Bryce. It was about the kind of environment that had allowed him to operate unchecked. "I'm making changes," Quentin said. "Effective immediately. There's going to be a full audit of how this location is run, and anyone who contributed to this kind of behavior won't have a place here." The assistant manager nodded. "That's good. It needed to happen." Quentin glanced at the security monitor. The restaurant was still running, but there was a noticeable shift. Employees moved with more purpose, the tension from earlier beginning to fade. He could see the hostess now seating a couple that had just walked in, no hesitation this time. "Get the staff together," Quentin said. "I want to talk to everyone." She left the office, and within minutes, the employees had gathered in the dining area. Some looked nervous, others relieved. Quentin faced them, letting his gaze move across the group. "I know tonight was a shock," he said, "but this was overdue. What happened here, what's been happening here, is unacceptable. No one should be turned away because of how they look or where they come from. That's not the kind of business I built, and it's not the kind of business this will be moving forward." A younger server, barely out of his teens, shifted on his feet. "Are we all getting fired?" he asked hesitantly. Quentin shook his head. "No, but things are going to change. There's going to be accountability from the top down. If you were part of the problem, you'll have to answer for it. If you were trying to do the right thing but didn't feel like you had the power to change anything, that's going to change too." The employees absorbed his words, some nodding, others watching him carefully. "I'm not just here for tonight," Quentin continued. "I'll be back regularly, and I'll be setting up a direct line for employees to report issues without fear of retaliation." The assistant manager stepped forward. "And if anyone has concerns about the new direction, now's the time to speak up." Silence followed. Then the hostess, the one who had been caught in the middle of Bryce's decisions, shifted slightly. "I just want to do my job the right way," she said quietly, "without being scared of making the wrong person upset." Quentin met her gaze. "That's exactly what's going to happen." Another server, a man in his 30s, crossed his arms. "And what about customers who cause problems? We've had some rough ones before." Quentin nodded. "Legitimate concerns will always be addressed. But there's a difference between handling disruptive customers and turning people away just because they don't fit some unspoken standard." The server considered that, then gave a small nod. Quentin took a breath. "I know this isn't an easy change, but it's necessary." This restaurant will be better for it. And the people who work here will be better for it. The tension in the room eased slightly. Employees exchanged glances, some with cautious optimism, others still processing everything. Quentin looked around. Now let's get back to work. With that, the meeting ended. The staff returned to their stations, the energy in the restaurant shifting towards something more focused, more intentional. Quentin stepped back, watching as things fell into place. This was only the beginning, but it was a beginning he could stand behind. Quentin remained in the restaurant for the rest of the evening, watching as the staff adjusted to the sudden shift in leadership. Some employees moved hesitantly, still unsure of how much had truly changed. Others seemed relieved, working with a newfound sense of purpose now that Bryce was gone. As closing time approached, he gathered the assistant manager and a few senior employees in the back office. He wanted to ensure that the transition was handled properly and that no one would try to backslide into old habits once he left. The assistant manager leaned against the desk, arms crossed. What happens next? Quentin rested his hands on the back of a chair. Immediate restructuring. Bryce wasn't the only problem, he was just the most obvious one. I'll be reviewing the management at every location. If there are other people like him, they won't last. One of the senior servers, a woman who had been working at the restaurant for years, nodded. Good. He made this place miserable for a lot of us. Quentin focused on her. Did you ever report him? She hesitated. Once. It didn't go anywhere. I was told to work around it. After that, I gave up trying. That confirmed what Quentin already suspected. The issue wasn't just Bryce, it was the system that had allowed him to thrive. The people responsible for enforcing company policies had either ignored complaints or actively dismissed them. That wouldn't happen again. You won't have to work around problems anymore, Quentin said. From now on, there will be a direct reporting line to me and senior leadership outside this location. No more complaints disappearing into a void. The assistant manager nodded. That'll make a difference. Quentin wasn't done. There's also going to be mandatory retraining. Not just here, but at every location. I want every employee to understand exactly how we treat people. If anyone refuses to get on board, they can find somewhere else to work. A younger employee who had been silent until now finally spoke. What about the customers we turned away? The ones who got sent back into the cold? That question had been weighing on Quentin's mind all night. He had watched it happen in real time, and it still didn't sit right with him. Tomorrow morning, I'll be reaching out to those customers personally if I can find them. They deserve an apology and a chance to come back, this time as welcomed guests. The assistant manager straightened. I'll help with that. We have security footage. If we can identify them, we can try to reach out. Quentin appreciated the initiative. Do it. The room fell quiet for a moment, the weight of the night settling over everyone. The senior server broke the silence. Do you think it'll be enough? Quentin didn't hesitate. No, but it's the start of something better. With that, the meeting ended. Employees gathered their things, locking up for the night. Some exchanged quiet words before leaving, processing everything that had happened. Quentin waited until the last employee had gone before stepping outside into the cold night air. He glanced up at the restaurant sign, the name he had built over years of hard work. It still meant something to him, but tonight had proven that if he wasn't careful, it could become something he didn't recognize. That wasn't going to happen. He pulled out his phone and made a note first thing in the morning. He would start the process of personally visiting every location in his chain. If this had been happening here, there was no telling what else had slipped past him. He had built this business from the ground up, and now it was time to rebuild the trust that had been broken. And he wouldn't stop until it was done. Quentin arrived at his corporate office early the next morning. The previous night had made one thing clear: systemic change was needed, not just at one location but across the entire company. He had built this business on a foundation of hospitality, and somewhere along the way that foundation had cracked. It was his responsibility to fix it. His first order of business was to meet with his executive team. He had called an emergency meeting, and by the time he stepped into the conference room, they were all seated, some looking concerned, others unreadable. These were the people who were supposed to uphold the company's values, yet Bryce had been able to operate unchecked for far too long. Quentin took a seat at the head of the table, setting down a folder containing notes from his undercover visit. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I visited one of our locations last night," he began. "Not as the CEO, but as a customer. What I saw was unacceptable." A few of the executives exchanged glances. One of them, Richard, his head of operations, leaned forward, hands clasped. "What exactly happened?" Quentin met his gaze. "A manager turned me away at the door. Not because we were full, but because he didn't like the way I looked. He did the same to multiple guests' families, travelers, people who just wanted a meal. This wasn't bad service. It was targeted exclusion." Silence spread through the room. Some looked down at their notes, others shifted in their seats. "Bryce was fired on the spot," Quentin continued. "But this isn't about one person. It's about a culture that allowed him to operate like that without consequence." "I want to know how we got here." One of the executives, Linda, who oversaw employee training, cleared her throat. "We've had policies in place to prevent this kind of behavior, but enforcement has always been left to district managers." Quentin looked at her. "And how often are those policies actually reinforced?" Linda hesitated. "We do annual reviews." "That's not enough," Quentin cut in. "A policy isn't worth anything if employees know they can ignore it without consequence." Richard exhaled. "Look, you're right. This shouldn't have happened. But we've expanded fast. When we were smaller, you were hands-on. You knew every manager personally. Now we've got over 1,000 employees. It's harder to keep control." Quentin didn't let him off the hook. "That's not an excuse. Growth isn't a reason to abandon standards. If anything, it means we need to be more vigilant." A younger executive, Jordan, who handled customer experience, finally spoke up. "I've seen an increase in complaints about service inconsistencies. Some locations have great reviews, others don't. Maybe this is part of the reason why." Quentin nodded. "I don't want maybe. I want facts. Starting today, I want a full audit of management practices across all locations. Every district manager will be required to visit their stores in person and report back on operations. No more assuming things are running smoothly just because sales numbers are decent." Richard frowned slightly. "That's going to take time." Quentin's tone didn't waver. "Then start now." Linda adjusted her glasses. "What happens if we find more managers like Bryce?" Quentin didn't hesitate. "They're replaced." The room fell silent again. This was bigger than just one location, and everyone in the room knew it. Jordan leaned forward slightly. "Are you planning to go undercover again?" Quentin considered the question. "Yes. Not at the same location, but at others. I need to see for myself what's happening at ground level." Richard exhaled. "You really think that's necessary?" Quentin met his gaze. "Do you think I would have found out about Bryce any other way?" Richard had no response. Quentin stood, signaling the meeting was over. "I expect updates by the end of the week." "We're fixing this now." As the executives filed out, Quentin remained in the conference room, staring at the reports in front of him. He had spent years building this company, but last night had shown him just how much he had lost sight of. That was going to change, and he wasn't stopping until it did.